Chapter 6. Tip. At first, Jim couldn't tell one boy from another. They all had the same sallow, thin faces and dark sunken eyes, and they all wore the same scratchy grey clothes and caps. They had their hair cropped and combed exactly the same way, except for the boy who'd spoken to him in the yard. His hair had a wild way of its own. He found himself following this boy round because he was the only one he could recognise. But it was a long time before he spoke to him. It was a long time before Jim felt like talking to anyone. He was numb and wrapped up in himself. But it was one morning in the schoolroom that Tip spoke to him and became the nearest thing to a friend that Jim could ever hope to have. The schoolroom was a long, dim room with candles set into every other desk. The little window had been painted over so they couldn't look out. There was a fireplace at one end with sheets steaming around it. Old women wandered in to see to the sheets, putting wet ones up and taking dry ones down. This was their job in the workhouse, washing the clothes of the rich. The women would sit from time to time by the fire, mumbling to each other, sometimes cackling out remarks to the boys or shouting out the wrong answers. There were 4 big arches across the ceiling with letters on them, and Mr. Barrack would begin every day by pointing at the arches and asking one of the boys to read out the words. God is good, God is holy, God is just, God is love. The women would chant out before the boys had a chance, sometimes in the wrong order just for fun. One morning, it was Tip's turn to answer the question. He turned to the women and held out his hand for them to speak. They shook their heads, shaking with silent laughter, and Tip laughed out loud. Mr. Barrack shook him by the back of his jacket, half lifting him off the floor. "There's nothing to laugh at here," he shouted. "No, sir, there ain't," Tip agreed. For most of the rest of the morning, Mr. Barrack read out loud to the boys, pacing up and down the room as he did so. Curled in his hand was the end of a knotted rope, which he swung as he walked, striking it across a desk from time to time to make the boys jump. Every now and then he stopped and pointed at a boy who had to stand up and recite the sentence he'd just heard. If he got it wrong, Mr. Barrack would swing the knotted end of the rope across the boy's hand. One morning the boys were given chalks and slates to use. A visitor had brought them in as a present. They sat on the desk throughout the morning, and the boys longed to have a go. "Now you can write," Mr. Barrack told them at last. Tim put his hand up. "Please, sir, what should we write?" "Speak up. What should we write?" Mr. Barrack roared back. "What should you write? The Lord's Prayer, if you please." Jim risked a look round at the boys as they bent to their task. He put his elbows on his desk and his head in his hands. Beside him, Tip squeaked his chalk across his slate. He glanced sideways at Jim. "Why ain't you writing?" he whispered. "'Cause I can't write," Jim whispered back. "I never knew how to write." "Core, it's easy. Just wiggle your chalk across the slate like this." His chalk scraped and laboured. "There." He leaned back in triumph and showed it to Jim. "That's good," said Jim. "What does it say?" Tip's amazed eyebrows shot up. "I don't know. I can't read." Jim spluttered into his hand, and Mr. Barrack jerked awake. "Did you laugh then?" Jim felt as he had frozen to his seat. "No, he didn't. It was me." Tip jumped up as the schoolmaster swung his rope in readiness and swished it down across the boy's outstretched hands. Mr. Barrack towered over Jim. "What did he say to you?" Jim forced himself to stand up, his legs trembling like reeds in the water. "He said he can't read, sir." "Can't read?" the teacher bellowed. "Can't read? I'll say he can't read. What do any of you want with reading and writing?" He pulled Tip's hand towards him again and lashed the rope across it. Right, Mr. Barrack barked, and Jim picked up his chalk and scribbled furiously, just as Tip had done. At the end of the morning, Mr. Barrack told the boys to get out their instruments, and with a great shoving of desks and scuffle of boots, they ran to the big cupboards, only to be shouted at and made to do it all again, in silence. I'd have got hit anyway, Tip muttered to Jim. Did it hurt? Jim asked. Tip shook his head. Once Barrack starts hitting you, Barrack always hits you, he said. Every day if he can. Just don't let him have a chance to start. Tell Barrack Tip did it if he blames you for anything. A drum was placed on the desk for them to share, and Tip stood up and reached out for a stick. At a wave of the schoolmaster's hand, the hymn tune started. It was like nothing Jim had ever heard before. Tip poked him with a drumstick and mouthed at him over the row to bang the other side of the drum with it. He watched Tip first to try and work out some kind of rhythm, and he saw that all the boys seemed to be chanting something. What are they saying? Jim shouted, as close to Tip's ear as he could get. Tip turned towards him. I hate this place, Jim could hear Tip's voice. I hate this place. Bang, bang, bang. He thumped the drum in time to every word. So do I, said Jim. Bang, bang, bang. He shouted into the darkness, opening up his throat to let all the tightness out. I want Dad. I want Ma. Bang, bang, bang. I want Emily. Bang, bang, bang. I want Liz. Bang, bang, bang. I want to go home. Mr. Barrack raised his hand, and the sound stopped as if it had been torn away in shreds. Silence. Utter, swirling, hugging silence. Jim felt his thoughts tumbling into it and then settling into calm. He felt better.